I'm the Consul General of Canada, based in Detroit, but responsible for Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. What that means is I'm the senior diplomat for those 4 states, working with the embassy and the ambassador in Washington. And we have a mission of about 20 people, and we do international business development, investment development. We do a lot of advocacy. We follow key issues in state governments. We deal with the federal elected representatives and senators in our 4 states. And we assist Canadians in distress and provide basic services like passport and whatnot.
So both of our countries are in an interesting situation as we speak. We're in negotiations in terms of trade. The U.S. and Mexico have already reached a deal. Canada and the United States are in the middle of talks. So where are we in terms of these trade discussions?
Okay, we've been negotiating NAFTA for a year now. And the idea is to modernize and update NAFTA, which is 24 years old. And when it was negotiated, it was the most modern agreement of its type. Now it's showing its age. One example I like to use is there's no chapter on e-commerce. So 24 years ago, if you said Amazon, people would think of that large river down in South America. Now if you say Amazon, you think of this large company that is dependent on e-commerce. But there are no rules regarding that in the NAFTA, so we need to update that. And there's a number of other areas we need to modernize. It's a very complex negotiation. There are 31 chapters, and we have had, I think, over 150 Canadian officials involved in the negotiation, and the U.S. and Mexico have had their same. We made a lot of progress. This summer, the U.S. and Mexico worked together to sort out their bilateral issues. There are always bilateral aspects in a negotiation like this. They finished a week ago, Monday, and then Canada is working with the U.S. as we speak to sort out the Canada-U.S. bilateral issues, and then all 3 countries will have to get back together again to finalize the text of NAFTA, or whatever the new agreement might be called.
So there are some people who say that this type of deal shouldn't go through unless all 3 countries are involved. What is Canada's take on that?
Well, NAFTA is the largest free trade area in the world and the most successful. Together, our trade among ourselves has grown to over $1 trillion. And Canada's position is NAFTA should have all 3 countries, and I think it's been beneficial to all 3.
So what are, obviously these current negotiations, it's still sensitive because it's happening literally as we speak and over the weekend. But what have been some of the sticking points or the things that Canada wants to see out of these deals?
Well, Ambassador Lighthizer and Foreign Minister Freeland have agreed not to negotiate in public, so I can't get into a lot of the details. But what's important is they're negotiating, making good progress, and both sides are approaching it in good faith and with goodwill. But they are very complex and sensitive issues on both sides, so we are taking the time to get a deal. From Canada's point of view, we want a deal that's good for Canada. I'm sure the American negotiators want a deal good for the U.S., the Mexicans good for Mexico. But I'd like to quote Vice President Pence when we're talking about these issues, because he said what we are looking for in NAFTA is a win-win-win. So, but as you said, the negotiations are ongoing, and I really can't get into the details.
So obviously they are ongoing, and like we said, it's happening over the weekend, but it seems like they're getting pretty close in terms of agreement. But if something doesn't happen, if we don't reach an agreement, or this continues to be drawn out, what happens then?
I'm not going to speculate on what may or may not happen. I just like to underscore that Canada is the United States' largest customer. We buy more from the U.S. than China does. We might buy more from the U.S. than the UK does. We buy more than Japan does. In fact, we buy more than the UK, China, and Japan combined. So when you're dealing with your largest customer, you want to make sure things are working well. And the US, on the flip side, US is Canada's largest customer as well. So we have 2 large trading partners trying to find the deal that's best for both sides.
So as you alluded to, both the United States and Canada are critical in terms of this type of trade partnership, but not only the two countries, but also Canada and Kentucky have a huge partnership in terms of trade. So what are some of the biggest imports and exports that Kentucky and Canada go back and forth on?
Well, much like the U.S., for Kentucky, Canada is your largest export market. You sell us $7.7 billion of goods a year. We sell you about 3.6 billion. So it's a good two-way trade, over 11 billion plus trade and services. What's interesting is more than half of what you sell us are related to transportation, either automobiles, automotive parts, or aircraft and aircraft parts. You also sell us a range of other products. There's $200 million that you sell us in agricultural goods. There's about $200 million that Canada sells Kentucky in agricultural goods. So good two-way trade. We of course enjoy fine Kentucky bourbon, and you buy Canadian wine. But it's a very broad range of products, and a lot of what we sell each other gets incorporated into products that get sold back. For example, if you buy a car that's assembled in Canada, it's about 50% US parts. And supply chains have grown up over the decades because we've had free trade in cars and car parts since 1965. And we have a very efficient trade. And what we want to do is make sure that Canada, the US, and Mexico working together can compete with the rest of the world. Because that's where our real competitors are, Europe, South America, Asia.
So because of all these discussions about trade and tariffs recently, there's been a lot of issues that have started to arise, and especially with certain industries, including in Kentucky. So what is this type of discussion and honestly drama done for done to Canada and for Kentucky, in your opinion?
Well, it certainly raised the profile of NAFTA from what it used to be. Most people didn't know or talk about it, but now Americans and Kentuckians are realizing how important it is and how important Canada is to you. There's 112,000 jobs here in Kentucky that depend either on trade with Canada or Canadian investment. There's over 100 Canadian companies who've invested here in Kentucky. I passed one coming to this interview. If you look at the US as a whole, it's 9 million jobs in the United States depend on trade with Canada. So it's important both ways. We have excellent relations with Kentucky. Get along very well with the governor. I've met regularly with legislators. And what's really special is that the United States ambassador to Canada is Kelly Craft. And she's a very good ambassador representing the US as a whole, but she has a special something for Kentucky. And it's been very helpful to have her as the ambassador because she's reached out to Canadians and she's helped deal with some of these issues.
So while we're in the midst of this, what is the most important thing that you want people to understand about trade between Canada and Kentucky and about the current negotiations and discussions?
Well, we are friends, partners, and allies. Canada-US trade is basically balanced. We trade $680 billion a year between Canada and the US. That's $1.8 billion a day in trade. 400,000 people cross the Canada-US border every single day. We have a 5,500-mile non-militarized border, which we patrol together, and we work together to make sure that North America as a whole is secure. We're best friends. At the moment, we're working out a NAFTA deal, but that's not going to affect our long-term relationship, I hope. And and Canadians love to come down this way, especially when it snows. The one other thing is the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. On steel, Canada and the U.S. have significant two-way trade. The U.S. is running a big surplus with Canada. We buy half your steel. On aluminum, Our aluminum goes into a lot of key products built in Kentucky, especially in the aerospace area. And the fact that the U.S. took this action claiming that Canada was a national security threat doesn't really fit with the facts. I've heard it described as an affront to Canadians, absurd. A former U.S. ambassador to Canada recently described it as hogwash. But it affects both sides because Canada, on its side, took countermeasures. So we have applied tariffs on $12.8 billion of U.S. exports to Canada. A lot of steel, aluminum, and some other products, and including, unfortunately, Kentucky whiskey. We have 10% tariff on the really good bourbons you produce here. We hope that those measures come off. We're doing a dollar for dollar. But the day your tariffs come off on Canadian goods, our tariffs will come off on the U.S. And I'm hoping that it's a completely separate issue from NAFTA, but it is one that is affecting Kentuckians and Canadians. It hurts our businesses, our workers, and our consumers on both sides. So we're hoping the sooner we can resolve that issue, the better.